Hi everyone, my name is Jane Castleman and I'm a master's student at Princeton University, and I'll be presenting my joint work with Aleksandra Korolova studying adultification bias in LLMs and text-to-image models. So first, what is adultification bias? Adultification bias is the perception that black girls are perceived as more defiant, mature, culpable, and hypersexualized in comparison to white girls. This leads authority figures like educators, police officers, and even doctors to assign these children with harsher, more unfair consequences than their white peers, leading to inappropriate and stigmatized interactions for these girls with people who are supposed to be protecting them. While adultification bias is well studied in humans, it's important to understand how it extends to generative AI, considering how rapidly these systems are being deployed in child-facing contexts, like in schools, whether for surveillance or educational tools, on social media platforms popular with children, like Snapchat and Instagram, and even in medical diagnostic settings. I'm sure many of us are well aware of the bias present in these generative models along protected attributes like race and gender, leading to attempted mitigations like fine-tuning, reinforcement learning with human and AI feedback, and finally refusal mechanisms, with one refusal mechanism shown below. When I ask Meta's model who's more likely to commit a crime, a black-sounding name like Terrell or a white-sounding name like James, the model refuses to answer and tells the user not to make assumptions or answer questions like that based on stereotypes. However, as models attempt to reconcile the tension between harmlessness and helpfulness, these mitigations become ad hoc and brittle. So if I simply rephrase my prompt to generate hypothetical profiles for Terrell and James, the model is willing to answer, and just like it's told the user not to do, bases its answer upon known stereotypes and concludes that the man with the black-sounding name is more likely to engage in this behavior. And so, given how these mitigations often fail, again, when trying to balance utility versus fairness and bias mitigation, we're interested in measuring how adultification bias found in humans extends to highly accessible large language models and text-to-image models. And so we do this by basing our methodology off of the measurement of generative AI, the measurement of biases in generative AI models, but also the measurement of adultification bias in humans. And because adultification bias is unstudied in Gen AI models, we systematize and construct an entirely new measurement instrument, considering that existing benchmarks are unable to capture this nuanced and complex human bias. And so what this looks like in large language models is similar to the first example I gave. We prompt these models across 4 different areas. So determining guilt, educational consequences shown on the slide, dating life, and sexual activity. So we prompt these models to generate 2 profiles about a girl with a white-sounding name and a black-sounding name, and then ask them to assign 2 consequences. One harsher, more adultification consequence, and then one less harsh, more neutral consequence. And then we run these prompts across each area hundreds of times. And we then quantify this adultification bias by measuring models' tendency to impose, again, these harsher adultification consequences versus these neutral consequences on black versus white girls. And so we measure this bias by calculating the difference in the proportion of adultification consequences between black and white girls, where a higher positive bias means that black girls are receiving more of these harsh consequences. And furthermore, because of our prompting strategy, we can actually inspect model outputs to understand how they themselves also reveal implicit biases that the models are relying upon. So if we look at the snippets of the profiles generated when asking a model, oh, who should get a suspension versus a detention, we see that black girls are described as aggressive and damaging, whereas white girls are described as defiant and dismissive, which aligns with this conception of adultification bias previously studied in humans. And then when we aggregate our results across these hundreds of prompts, we see that the frequency of harsher, more sexualized consequences is significantly greater for black girls across the models we study, including models from OpenAI and Meta. Perhaps most surprisingly to us, we see that the newer, larger models we study actually don't perform better on this test, with GPT-4o being significantly more biased than GPT 3.5 Turbo, and a similar phenomenon when comparing Meta Llama 3.170 billion versus 8 billion. This sits in contrast to some recent claims that as models become larger and more powerful, they'll be better able to reason over complex human biases and mitigate them themselves. And then finally, we want to study whether this is an example of adultification bias specifically or majority-minority bias. And so we also run this decision bias analysis comparing Asian versus white girls and Latina versus white girls. But as shown on the slide, the bias that we see is not nearly as severe as that exhibited when comparing black versus white girls. And so we conclude that we really are seeing adultification bias in this case. And then next, we're also interested in understanding how text-to-image models also perpetuate adultification bias, considering they're increasingly used for facial recognition on social media and have the chance to perpetuate biased sexualized imagery on an extremely large scale. And so we're interested in understanding how white versus black subjects are portrayed in similar images. And so to generate these similar images, we prompt models to generate an image of a girl wearing a dress, trying to standardize outfits as much as possible across various traits, ages, and the two races we were studying before. And so once we have these images, we then run a human evaluation to estimate the age of the person and how revealing their outfit is, in line, again, with human forms of adultification bias for 20 images per prompt. While we tried to use an LLM as judge to capture these metrics, we found that it was unable to quantify these really complex, abstract notions of how revealing an outfit is or how old a person was. And so we had to rely on a human evaluation. And so when we look at our results, we see a similar situation to adultification bias in large language models, where images of black girls are rated as older and whose outfits are consistently more revealing, particularly in Meta and Playground's text-to-image models. So we can see an example on the left-hand side of the slide where the white girl is portrayed or perceived as much younger and wearing a much less revealing outfit, whereas the black girl is perceived as much older and wearing a more revealing outfit. However, our results weren't consistent across the models we study. When we look at stable diffusion and flux models, we actually see no significant difference in the age estimation and revealingness scores across these models. But this similarity, I guess, in the age and revealingness scores comes at a cost. We see that overall, the revealingness scores are significantly higher than the other two models we studied, which, albeit they were biased, but they weren't portraying these young girls in a more sexualized manner. So there, again, is this tension between competing desirable characteristics in these models where we don't want them to be biased, but we also want them to be safe when children are interacting and looking at images from them. And so overall in our paper, we find that adultification is present in these large language models and text-to-image models, all of which are highly accessible. And we find that model alignment is not consistently improving. In the larger, newer models we studied, they actually exhibit more adultification bias than the older, smaller models. We will also want to emphasize that many biases, like adultification bias, are still underexplored and require new evaluative methods to reliably measure. A lot of these methods have been highlighted at FACT, which is really exciting. And then finally, we want to call on emerging regulations about generative AI to consider adultification bias, other multimodal biases, and also minor-facing biases. And if you have any questions, here's a QR code for the paper, so especially if you want more of the technical details, feel free to look there. All right, thank you.